Good evening, and welcome back. For roughly 400 years, the great kings of the ancient world wrote letters to one another. The Pharaoh of Egypt wrote to the king of the Hittites. The king of Babylon wrote to the Pharaoh. They addressed each other as brother. They complained about the quality of gifts, argued over marriage arrangements, sent doctors and sculptors and physicians back and forth across 1,000 miles, and grumbled when a letter went unanswered for too long. It was, in its way, the first international system, and it worked. And then, within about the span of a single human lifetime, it stopped. Every major palace from mainland Greece to the coast of Syria was burned or abandoned. An empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill vanished so completely that its capital was not identified again until the 20th century. Writing itself disappeared from Greece for 400 years. And nobody wrote down why, because the people whose job it was to write things down were among the first to go. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time in the comments. It is a quiet pleasure to know that someone in another city, in another hour of the night, is settling in to hear the same story. Now dim the lights, let a fan hum somewhere in the background, and let us go back to a world that had every reason to think it would last. To understand what was lost, you have to first accept something that is genuinely difficult, which is that the world of 1300 before the Common Era was more connected than the world that followed it for the next 1,000 years. There were, in that period, a small number of great powers, and they all knew each other. In the south was Egypt, in the height of what historians call the New Kingdom, ruled by the pharaohs of the 18th and then the 19th dynasties, the Egypt of Tutankhamun and Ramesses, with its temples at Thebes and its wealth in gold from Nubia. In central Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, was the empire of the Hittites, ruled from a mountain capital called Hattusa, a city of stone walls, gates carved with lions, and an archive of tens of thousands of clay tablets. The Hittites had sacked Babylon centuries earlier. They had fought Egypt to a draw at the Battle of Kadesh, and they had then signed with Egypt what is very probably the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world, a copy of which hangs today at the headquarters of the United Nations. The Hittites are worth a moment on their own, because they are the great forgotten power of the ancient world, and because their disappearance was the most complete of all. They spoke an Indo-European language related distantly to Greek and Latin and Sanskrit, which came as a considerable shock when it was worked out in 1915. Their capital sat over 1,000 meters up on the Anatolian plateau, in country that is bitterly cold in winter, and it was fortified on a scale that suggests genuine anxiety. They practiced a form of kingship in which the ruler was answerable to the gods in an oddly contractual way, and their tablets include royal prayers in which a king asks the gods what he has done wrong to deserve a plague, and works methodically through possible offenses, including those of his father, like a man auditing his own accounts. Their great confrontation with Egypt came at Kadesh in Syria around 1274, when Ramesses II marched north and was very nearly destroyed by a Hittite ambush, extracted himself, and then went home and had the whole affair carved on temple walls as a personal triumph at extraordinary length. The Hittite version, unsurprisingly, differs. What actually followed was a stalemate, and then, some 16 years later, a treaty. Copies survive from both sides, in Egyptian on temple walls, and in Akkadian on clay tablets from Hattusa, and they broadly match, which is itself remarkable. The two powers agreed not to attack each other, to come to each other's aid, and to return fugitives. A reproduction of the tablet hangs at the United Nations, and it is generally described as the oldest surviving international peace agreement, which is not quite the same as saying it was the first, but it is the earliest one we can read from both parties. In Mesopotamia were Assyria and Babylonia, the old heartlands, with their scribal schools and their laws and their astronomers. To the east was Elam, in what is now Iran. Between the Hittites and Assyria had been the kingdom of Mitanni, which was swallowed up in the course of the period, which is worth noting because it shows that states did fall in this world, routinely, and were absorbed, and that this was normal and survivable, and not what happened later. On Cyprus was a kingdom the others called Alashia, and Cyprus mattered enormously, for a reason we will come to. And across the Aegean, in mainland Greece, were the Mycenaeans, the people who would later be remembered as the Greeks who besieged Troy. They lived in citadels with walls built of stones so large that later Greeks assumed giants had put them there. They had palaces at Mycenae, at Tiryns, at Pylos, at Thebes, and they wrote in a script called Linear B, which we can read, and which turns out to contain no poetry, no history, and no letters, only lists. Around and between all of these were the trading cities of the Levantine coast, and the greatest of them for our purposes was Ugarit, in what is now northern Syria, a port city that sat at exactly the point where the goods of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Cyprus, and Egypt all met and changed hands. Ugarit was rich, cosmopolitan, and literate to an unusual degree, and the tablets in its ruins are written in something like 8 different languages and several different scripts. Its scribes had developed one of the earliest alphabets, a set of about 30 cuneiform signs, which is a startling thing to find in a world where everyone else was using several hundred. That was the map. And the thing that held it together was not conquest. It was correspondence, and it was trade. We know about the correspondence because of an accident, and the accident happened at a place in Egypt now called Amarna. In the 14th century before the Common Era, the pharaoh Akhenaten did something drastic. He rejected the traditional gods, elevated a single deity represented by the disk of the sun, and built an entirely new capital city on an empty stretch of desert on the east bank of the Nile. After his death, the experiment was reversed, his city was abandoned, and his name was chiseled out of the records, which meant that his capital was left to the sand rather than being built over, which is how archaeology gets lucky. In the late 19th century, a local woman digging for old mud brick to use as fertilizer turned up clay tablets. They were eventually recognized for what they were, and something in the region of 380 of them have been recovered. They are the diplomatic files of the Egyptian Foreign Office, letters received from other kings, and copies of letters sent, and they cover a few decades in the middle of the 14th century. The first surprise is the language. Almost all of them are written in Akkadian, the language of Babylon, in cuneiform. Egyptian scribes were writing to Hittite kings in Babylonian. Akkadian had become the common diplomatic language of the entire Near East, spoken natively by very few of the people using it, learned in schools by scribes from Anatolia to the Nile, precisely because it was neutral ground. There were scribes in Egypt whose whole profession was writing a foreign language to foreigners, and there were tablets found at Amarna that are essentially textbooks and word lists used for training them. The second surprise is the tone. These are not stiff proclamations. They are letters between men who are competitive, touchy, and in constant need of one another. The king of Babylon writes to complain that when his messengers went to Egypt, nobody made a proper fuss of them. He writes about a marriage negotiation and notes, dryly, that a woman was sent to him, and he has no idea whether she is actually the pharaoh's daughter or just somebody's daughter, since nobody who knew her came along to confirm it. The king of Assyria writes asking for gold and points out that in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust, and that he is engaged in an expensive building project. The king of Mitanni writes at length about gold statues he was promised. He had been told he would receive solid gold statues. What arrived were statues of wood, plated. He is extremely unhappy about this, he says so repeatedly, and he brings it up again in subsequent letters, which is a level of persistence that anyone who has ever chased an unpaid invoice will recognize. The king of Alashaya on Cyprus writes to apologize for a delayed shipment of copper, explaining that a plague has struck his country and killed his coppersmiths. He also, in another letter, asks the pharaoh not to lump him in with the kings of the Hittites in Babylon when sending gifts, because he would like to be considered separately and better. Beneath all of the friction is a structure. These kings called each other brother when they considered each other equals, and father or son when one was subordinate. They exchanged gifts constantly, and the gifts were not decorative. In a world without a monetary system as we understand it, a gift was a treaty, and the value of the gift was the strength of the relationship, which is why receiving a wooden statue with gold leaf on it was not a matter of taste, but of insult. They exchanged daughters in marriage. They sent each other specialists. A Hittite king asked Egypt for a physician. Egypt sent one. Another ruler asked for a sculptor and for an expert in a particular kind of divination. And underneath the letters, ships and donkeys moved constantly. And this is where the fragility begins to show, because the entire age was built on a metal that no single country could produce. Bronze is an alloy. It is copper with a small proportion of tin mixed in, usually around 1 part in 10, and the addition transforms it. Pure copper is soft. Bronze is hard enough to hold an edge, and it casts beautifully. And for roughly 2,000 years, it was the material of every sword, spearhead, axe, chisel, plow tip, cauldron, and mirror that mattered. Copper was obtainable. Cyprus had a great deal of it, so much that the island's name and the metal's name are entangled in most European languages. Tin was the problem. There is almost no tin in the eastern Mediterranean. The nearest substantial sources were far away in Central Asia, in what is now Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and possibly in Anatolia, and, at the very edge of the known world, in Cornwall and Iberia. Recent chemical work on tin ingots from Mediterranean shipwrecks has pointed remarkably to European sources as well. Either way, the essential fact holds. To make the bronze that armed a Mycenaean warrior standing on a hill in Greece, someone had to move a heavy, valuable metal across thousands of kilometers of mountain, desert, and sea through the territory of at least half a dozen kings every single year without fail. There is an object that makes this vivid better than any argument, and it is a shipwreck. In 1982, a young Turkish sponge diver mentioned to archaeologists that he had seen metal biscuits with ears on the seabed near a cape called Uluburun on the southern coast of Turkey. The biscuits with ears were copper ingots cast in a distinctive four-handled shape that made them easy to carry, and what was found beneath them is probably the single richest archaeological deposit of the late Bronze Age. The ship had gone down around the end of the 14th century. It was carrying about 10 tons of copper in something over 350 ingots. It was carrying roughly a ton of tin, which is very close to the exact ratio needed to make bronze, which means somebody had loaded it deliberately as a matched set. It had glass ingots in cobalt blue and turquoise and lavender, raw material for beads and inlay. It had ebony from Africa, ivory from hippopotamus and elephant, ostrich eggshells, tortoise shells, a ton of terebinth resin in jars, almonds, figs, olives, pomegranates, coriander, and spices. And it had objects from everywhere: Canaanite jars, Cypriot pottery, Mycenaean drinking cups, Baltic amber, which had come overland across the whole of Europe, an Egyptian gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti. Weights calibrated to several different regional standards, so that the merchant could trade with anyone he met. A wooden writing board with ivory hinges, of the kind that would have held a wax surface for keeping accounts, and which is the oldest known example of the object that later became the book. It was, in short, a floating cross-section of a world economy, and it sank, and nobody knows whose it was or where precisely it was going, and that is exactly the point. This was not an exceptional voyage. This was normal traffic. Behind that traffic stood a particular way of running a country, and its name is the palace economy, and understanding it explains why the collapse was so total. In the Mycenaean world, and in similar form at Ugarit and elsewhere, the palace was not merely the residence of a ruler, it was the accounting center of the entire region. The evidence for this is the Linear B tablets, and the story of how we can read them is worth telling on its own. Linear B was found at Knossos on Crete, and later at Pylos and Mycenae, and for 50 years nobody could read it. It was cracked in 1952 by an English architect named Michael Ventris, who had become fascinated with it as a schoolboy after hearing a lecture, and who worked on it in his spare time. He had assumed, as almost everyone had, that the language behind it would be something unknown. When his own decipherment kept producing Greek words, he initially thought he must be wrong. He was not. Linear B is Greek, written in a syllabic script, several centuries before anyone thought Greek was being written at all. Ventris died in a car accident 4 years later, at 34, and what the tablets say is astonishing in its dullness. There is no literature. There are no royal boasts. There are no letters. There are inventories. So many sheep at such a place belonging to such a man. So many chariot wheels, of which so many are serviceable. Rations of grain and figs issued to named groups of women and their children who appear to be textile workers. Quantities of perfumed oil. Bronze allocated to named smiths in specified weights, with a note of which smiths did not receive any. Lists of rowers. Lists of offerings to gods, some of whose names, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Dionysus, are already familiar, 700 years before the poems that made them famous. This is a bureaucracy of extraordinary detail, and it tells us that goods flowed into the palace and were then flowed back out again by administrators. The farmer did not sell his wool at a market. He delivered it as an obligation, and the palace recorded it and issued it to the workshops, and the workshops produced cloth, and the cloth went abroad in exchange for tin and ivory, and the palace fed the people who did the work. It is efficient. It is also brittle, in a specific and fatal way. There is no market underneath it to fall back on. If the palace burns, there is no institution that knows where the wool goes, or who owes what, or who is entitled to eat. The tablets themselves were not even meant to be permanent. They were sun-dried clay, meant to be recycled at the end of the accounting year, and the only reason we have them at all is that the palace is burned and fire bakes clay. Every Linear B tablet we possess is a document that survived because of the catastrophe that made it meaningless. It is worth coming down out of the palaces for a moment, because most people in this world never entered one. The overwhelming majority farmed. In Greece, they grew barley and wheat, tended olives and vines, kept sheep for wool and goats for milk, and lived in villages of small stone-footed houses with mud brick walls above. In the shadow of a citadel, they were obliged to supply. In the Levant and Anatolia, the crops were much the same, with the addition of figs, dates, and lentils. The diet was bread, oil, olives, cheese, pulses, and a little meat at festivals. Wine was widespread, and beer was widespread, and both were safer than standing water. Their year was set by the harvest and by the obligations recorded on tablets they could not read, which were held by men in a building on a hill. The linear B lists that name the women issued rations of grain and figs are naming real people, several hundred of them at Pylos alone, working wool and flax, with their children counted separately in the same entry. We have their job descriptions and their ration amounts, and no names for most of them at all. They wore wool, dyed where it could be afforded, and the most valuable dye in the world came from a sea snail crushed in quantity along the Levantine coast, which produced a purple so expensive that it later became the color of emperors, and which is the reasons the Greeks called those coastal people Phoenicians, the purple men. And they were, as far as we can tell, entirely dependent on the system above them for the resolution of a bad year. That was the arrangement. Deliver the quota in good times and be fed in the lean ones. It is not an unreasonable bargain, and it held for centuries, and everything that follows is the story of what happens when one side of it stops being able to keep its half. So that was the world. Interlocked, literate, wealthy, dependent on long-distance supply for its most basic military material, and administered by a small number of centralized institutions that held all the information. There is a detail in the Amarna correspondence that stays with you once you have noticed it. Some of the letters end with the scribe adding a short note of his own, addressed not to the king, but to his opposite number in the other palace, the man who would actually read the tablet out. One asks after the other's health. One asks him to put in a good word. These are two professionals, 1,000 kilometers apart, who have almost certainly never met and who write to each other constantly, adding a private line at the bottom of a head of state's correspondence because they can. Both of them have been dead for 34 centuries, and neither appears in any history of anything. Now, the cracks. The first thing that went wrong was almost certainly the climate, and the evidence for it does not come from any text. It comes from mud. At the bottom of lakes and lagoons, pollen settles year after year and is buried in layers. Core that sediment, count down through the layers, date them, and identify the pollen, and you can reconstruct what was growing in the surrounding landscape, century by century. Cores taken from the Sea of Galilee, from a salt lake on Cyprus, from lakes in Anatolia, and from the Nile Delta have been analyzed over the past 2 decades, and they tell a consistent story. Beginning somewhere around 1250 before the Common Era, and continuing for a long time afterward, the pollen record shifts away from cultivated trees and crops and toward the plants of dry, marginal, unfarmed land. Oxygen isotope records from cave formations point the same way. So do studies of ancient tree rings. The interpretation is a prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean, lasting not a season or a bad decade, but on the order of a century and a half. Not a single dramatic event, a grinding generational failure of rainfall. And here, the texts pick the story up in a way that is quietly chilling because the people writing them do not know what they are describing. There are letters from the last decades of the system about grain. A Hittite king writes to Ugarit about a shipment and states plainly that it is a matter of life and death. Another Hittite document instructs that a large quantity of grain be sent by ship and stresses the urgency. Egypt, which had the Nile and was therefore less exposed than anyone, sent grain to the Hittites, and this is recorded on the Egyptian side as an act of relief to a friendly power. Think about what that means. The Hittite Empire, one of the 2 or 3 greatest military powers on earth, which had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, and had then negotiated as an equal, was by the end importing food from Egypt to keep its people alive. The empire had not been defeated. It was hungry. Hunger does a specific set of things to a society, and they are all visible in the record. It empties the countryside first. Farmers on marginal land go under before anyone else, and they move. It raises the price of everything and makes the obligations of the palace economy impossible to meet, because you cannot deliver a quota of wool from a flock that is starved. It makes people move toward the coast and toward the cities, and then, when the cities cannot feed them either, it puts large numbers of hungry, displaced, armed people on the roads and on the water. And that, in all probability, is a large part of what the Sea Peoples actually were. The Sea Peoples are the most famous element of this story, and the most misunderstood, and it is worth being careful, because almost everything popularly said about them rests on a small number of Egyptian monuments, and Egyptian monuments are propaganda. The name itself is modern, coined by a 19th century French Egyptologist. The Egyptians never used it as a single term. What they recorded were the names of specific groups, appearing in different combinations at different times, in inscriptions from the reigns of at least 3 pharaohs. The names in the conventional transliterations include the Peliset, the Tjeker, the Shekelesh, the Danian, the Weshesh, the Shurdan, the Luka, and the Ekwesh. Some of these can be tentatively linked to places. The Luka are generally associated with Lycia in southwestern Anatolia. The Shurdan appear earlier as raiders, and then, remarkably, as mercenaries in the Egyptian army, fighting for the pharaoh in horned helmets that are clearly drawn in the reliefs. The Peliset are widely thought to be the people who settled the southern coast of Canaan and appear in the Hebrew scriptures as the Philistines. Beyond that, the identifications range from plausible to speculative, and honest scholarship acknowledges it. They first appear as a serious problem in the reign of Merneptah, around 1207, when a Libyan coalition invaded the western Nile Delta with allied groups from across the sea. Merneptah defeated them and recorded it, and on the same monument mentioned in passing a people called Israel, which is the earliest known reference to that name and which has occupied a great deal of scholarly attention for reasons unrelated to our story. The famous confrontation came about 30 years later, in the 8th year of the reign of Rameses III, which by the conventional chronology is 1187. The account is carved on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, in an inscription and a series of reliefs, and it is the single most quoted passage about this period. The text says that no land could stand before their arms. It names Hadi and Carchemish and Cyprus and Cilicia, and says they were cut off and destroyed at one time. It describes a camp set up in Amuru, in the Levant, and the people of it laying their hands on the lands to the very circuit of the earth, with their hearts confident and their thoughts saying, "Our plans will succeed." And then it says that Rameses defeated them. There are reliefs of a land battle and a sea battle. The sea battle is shown with Egyptian archers shooting from the shore and from ships, enemy vessels capsizing, men in the water. The enemy are shown with their families in ox carts, with women and children among them, which is not how a raiding party travels. It is how a migration travels. The reliefs themselves repay looking at closely, because whoever designed them was careful about detail in a way the text is not. The enemy warriors are shown in distinct groups, and the groups are distinguished by their headgear, which is presumably how the Egyptians told them apart. Some wear a tall crown of what appears to be feathers or reeds, set in a headband. Others wear horned helmets with a disc between the horns. Their swords are straight and long. Their ships have bird-headed posts at both bow and stern, and a single square sail, and they are shown without oars in the water, which some scholars read as a sign that they had been caught unprepared, and others read as artistic convention. And then there are the carts. In the land battle scene, behind the fighting, there are solid-wheeled ox carts, and in them are women and small children and bundles of belongings, and the oxen are shown rearing in panic. Egyptian artists were not in the habit of putting enemy children on temple walls. Whoever composed that scene had either seen such a thing or been told about it in detail, and it is the single strongest piece of evidence in the entire Egyptian record for what these people actually were, which is families on the move with everything they still owned. The Egyptian answer to them, incidentally, was not only military. Captured sea peoples were settled in Egyptian-controlled territory as garrison troops and paid and used. Egypt had been doing this with the Shurden for over a century, employing as royal bodyguards the descendants of men who had turned up as raiders. It is a policy that has been repeated by a great many empires since, and it says something about how blurred the line between invader and immigrant and mercenary actually was in this period. This is where care is needed. Egyptian victory monuments record victories, always, including some that did not happen. The battle almost certainly took place, and Egypt almost certainly held, but the inscription is not a chronicle of the collapse. It is one power's account of one confrontation, written to be carved on a temple wall, and it names as already destroyed a list of places that were in fact destroyed over a span of decades, and for reasons that had a great deal to do with things happening far from any sea. The older view, which held for the better part of a century, was that the sea peoples were the cause. A horde came out of the north and west, and it rolled through the eastern Mediterranean, and it knocked over every state in its path. The view most specialists now hold is close to the reverse. The sea peoples were, to a large extent, a symptom. They were displaced populations from regions that had already failed, moving with their households toward places that still had food, and fighting when they had to, and being absorbed as mercenaries when they could be, and settling permanently where they were able. A migration is what a famine looks like from the outside, which does not make them harmless. A large armed migration, arriving in a region that is already short of grain, whose trade routes are already interrupted, whose army is already stretched, is a lethal thing, and it is entirely capable of finishing off a state that would otherwise have limped on. Cause and symptom in this story are extremely hard to separate, and anyone who tells you the sequence with confidence is telling you more than the evidence supports. Which brings us to Ugarit, and to the most haunting documents of the entire period. Before the end, Ugarit had been something rather wonderful. It was not a great military power, and had no ambition to be one. It was a merchant city that had made itself indispensable, sitting on the coast with a harbor at its foot and the routes from Mesopotamia coming down behind it, and it had grown rich by being the place where everybody else's goods met. The palace had dozens of rooms and its own water system. The houses of ordinary merchants had stone-built family tombs underneath them, so that the dead stayed in the house. Its libraries were extraordinary. Alongside the commercial and diplomatic correspondence, the scribes of Ugarit wrote down the myths of their own gods, in their own language, in the alphabet they had developed, and those tablets are the single most important source we possess for Canaanite religion. There is a long cycle of poems about the storm god Baal, his palace, his conflict with the god of the sea and with death itself, and his sister, Anet, who is a figure of tremendous violence. There is an epic about a king named Keret, who loses his entire family, and is instructed by a god in a dream how to acquire another. There is a poem about a man named Akkad, and a bow he refuses to give up. These texts had been completely lost. When they were read in the 20th century, scholars of the Hebrew Bible found in them phrases, images, poetic structures, and divine epithets that were startlingly close to passages they had been studying for centuries. Ugarit gave the world back a religious literature that had been the immediate background to a much more famous one, and it did so entirely by accident, because a city burned and its clay was baked. Ugarit in its final years was ruled by a king named Amurapi, and he was in an impossible position. He was a vassal of the Hittites, which meant obligations. Hittite letters demanded ships. Hittite letters demanded grain. Hittite letters demanded that he send his forces to help elsewhere, and he did. And his fleet went off toward the Lycian coast, and his army went north into Hittite territory, and his city was left with what was left over. Then the enemy came. Among the tablets found at Ugarit is a letter from Amurapi to the king of Elachia on Cyprus, and it is short, and it is the most frequently quoted document from the collapse. It says, in substance, that the enemy's ships have come, that they have burned the towns and done wicked things in the country, that the king's own troops are in the land of Hatti, and his own ships are in Lycia, and that the country is abandoned to itself. It asks whether the other king is aware of this. It reads exactly like what it is, which is a man asking for help he knows is not coming. There is another from a senior official warning that enemy ships have been sighted and instructing that the towns be fortified and the troops brought in, and asking urgently for news. For decades, the standard account held that some of these tablets were found in a kiln, unbaked, having been placed there to be fired at the very moment the city fell, so that the last words of Ugarit were literally in the oven when the fire arrived. It is an unforgettable image, and it appears in a great many books. It should be said plainly that specialists have since questioned it. The stratigraphy of that deposit has been reassessed, and it now seems likely that the so-called kiln was not a kiln, and that the tablets do not all date to a single final moment. The story of the letters is true. The oven is probably not. What is not in doubt is that Ugarit burned. There is a destruction layer. There are arrowheads. The city was never reoccupied. A port that had been one of the great crossroads of the ancient world, where you could hear half a dozen languages in a morning, and where scribes had invented an alphabet, ceased to exist, and the harbor silted up, and the mound sat there until 1928, when a farmer's plow struck a stone slab and turned out to have found the roof of a tomb. And Ugarit was not alone. Between roughly 1200 and 1150, the destruction runs across the map in a way that is genuinely hard to take in. In Anatolia, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, a fortified city on a ridge with walls 6 kilometers around, came to an end. And here the archaeology holds a surprise, because the excavators found that the city had largely been emptied before it burned. The archives had been cleared of their most important documents. The valuables were gone. The grain silos had been emptied. Whatever happened at Hattusa, it does not look like a city taken by storm in a single night. It looks like a capital that was evacuated deliberately and in an orderly way by people who had decided it could no longer be held, and which was then burned, perhaps by whoever came afterward and found it standing open. The Hittite Empire did not survive the loss. It simply stopped, and its language stopped being written, and it was forgotten so completely that for 3,000 years the Hittites were known only as a name mentioned a few times in the Hebrew scriptures, until the ruins on that ridge were excavated in the early 20th century and identified. In Greece, the palaces went, Pylos burned, and its linear B tablets baked in the fire, and among them are documents that have been read as preparations for an emergency. There are tablets concerning the disposition of rowers, and tablets listing men described as watchers, guarding the coastal districts. Whether these are the last defensive measures of a doomed kingdom, or ordinary administration that happens to survive from a bad year, is, again, argued over. But Pylos had no fortification wall, and Pylos burned, and it was not rebuilt. Mycenae itself was damaged and shrank. Tyrannus was struck and partially recovered, and there is evidence of rebuilding there in a reduced form, people living in the ruins of something bigger. Thebes went. Across the Greek mainland, the great citadels either fell or contracted, and the population dropped, by estimates that in some regions run to more than half. On Cyprus, sites were destroyed and others founded. Along the Levantine coast, city after city shows a burn layer. In some places, the pottery that appears immediately afterward is different. A style with clear Aegean characteristics, made locally, which is the archaeological fingerprint of newcomers settling and staying, and which is the strongest physical evidence we have that the Sea Peoples were not only raiders, but migrants. Egypt survived, and this deserves emphasis because Egypt is the control case. It was attacked and it held, but it did not emerge unchanged. Within a generation or two of Ramesses III, the new kingdom was in serious difficulty. There is a record of what appears to be the first documented labor strike in history, when the workmen who built the royal tombs downed tools because their grain rations had not arrived. There are records of grain prices rising to extraordinary levels. There is documentation of large-scale robbery of the royal tombs, investigated by the state, which is a fairly reliable indicator that respect for the central authority had thinned. By around 1069, the new kingdom was over and Egypt had split, with a pharaoh in the north and the priesthood of Amun effectively ruling the south. There is one document from just after this that captures the change better than any statistic. It is the report of a man named Wenamun, an Egyptian official sent to Byblos on the Levantine coast to buy timber for a sacred boat. In the days of the Amarna letters, an Egyptian envoy in a Levantine port would have been treated with enormous deference. Wenamun is robbed on the way, kept waiting for weeks, and finally granted an audience with the local ruler, who has the records checked and points out, politely and devastatingly, that he is not Egypt's servant, that his ancestors sent timber because they were paid for it, and that Wenamun can have his wood when the money arrives. It is a small bureaucratic humiliation, written down by the man it happened to, and it is the sound of a superpower discovering it is not one anymore. So what actually caused it? This is the question, and the honest answer has changed shape considerably over the last 30 years. The single cause explanations have all been tried. Invasion by the Sea Peoples, earthquakes, and there is real evidence for a period of seismic activity in the Aegean and Anatolia, with collapsed walls and bodies found crushed under rubble at several sites. Drought and famine, which, as we have seen, is well supported. Internal rebellion, with the argument that a population squeezed by a palace bureaucracy in a famine might reasonably burn the palace. Changes in warfare, the old theory that massed infantry with javelins had made the chariot aristocracies obsolete. The interruption of the tin trade. The earthquake evidence deserves a closer look because it is more physical than most of it. At a number of sites across the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, excavators have found the specific signatures that seismologists recognize. Walls that have slumped in one consistent direction, columns fallen in parallel like felled trees, floors that have cracked and shifted along a line, and, at several places, human remains crushed beneath collapsed masonry with no sign of weapons or fire. Some archaeologists have argued for what is called an earthquake storm, a sequence of large quakes along a related fault system spread over decades, which is a real phenomenon and which has been documented in the same region in modern times. What an earthquake does to a city like this is not simply knock buildings down. It breaks the water supply, ruins the grain stores, kills the specialists, and empties the treasury into the repairs, and it does all of that to a state that is already short of food and already struggling to police its roads. The strongest version of the argument is not that earthquakes destroyed the Bronze Age. It is that they arrived at the worst possible moment and removed the last of the slack. Each of these explains some of the evidence, and none of them explains all of it. Earthquakes do not empty an archive in advance. Invaders do not cause a century of drought. Drought does not by itself burn a citadel. The framework that has largely replaced them borrows a term from other disciplines and calls it a systems collapse. The idea is that this world was not a set of independent kingdoms that each happened to fail. It was a single interlocking system, and its interdependence, which had been its enormous strength, became the mechanism of its destruction. Consider the sequence. A long drought reduces harvests everywhere at once. Reduced harvests mean the palace cannot meet its obligations, and populations move. Movement and insecurity make long-distance trade dangerous and expensive. Interrupted trade means less tin, and less tin means less bronze, and less bronze means weaker armies at precisely the moment when there are more armed and desperate people on the roads. Weakened states cannot send grain to each other, so a famine in one place can no longer be relieved from another, and the mutual aid that had made the system resilient becomes impossible. Each failure removes a support from the others. There is no single moment where it breaks, and there is no single villain, and by the time anyone could have identified the problem, there was no institution left with the reach to do anything about it. If it seems familiar, that is not an accident, and it is a large part of why this obscure period has become one of the most discussed in ancient history over the past decade. What followed in most of the region is what historians call a dark age, and the term is used carefully. It does not mean the people were stupid or savage. It means we cannot see them because the institutions that produced records stopped producing records. In Greece, the loss was almost total. Linear B was a palace accounting tool used by a small professional class to serve an institution, and when the institution burned, the skill had no purpose and no one to pass it to. Within a generation, nobody in Greece could write. Nobody in Greece would write again for something like 400 years. The population fell sharply. Long-distance trade shrank to almost nothing. Monumental buildings stopped completely. Figurative art largely vanished, and pottery decoration retreated into simple geometric patterns. The memory of the palaces faded into the belief that the massive walls had been built by giants. And there is one more city that belongs in this account, because it sits directly on the fault line between history and legend, and because almost everyone has heard of it. Troy stood at the northwestern corner of Anatolia, controlling the approach to the straits that lead up into the Black Sea, which is one of the more valuable pieces of real estate in the region, and a place where ships wait, sometimes for weeks, for a favorable wind. The mound was excavated from the 1870s onward, most famously by Heinrich Schliemann, whose methods were destructive and whose conclusions were frequently wrong, but who was right about the essential thing, which is that there was a city there. Excavation has revealed at least 9 major settlements stacked on top of one another across more than 3,000 years. 2 of those layers fall in our period. 1, a substantial and prosperous city with fine walls and towers, appears to have been damaged around the middle of the 13th century, possibly by an earthquake. The city rebuilt on a reduced scale, and that rebuilt city shows signs of a settlement under pressure. Large storage jars sunk into the floors of houses, buildings crowded closer together inside the walls, and then a destruction layer with burning, with weapons, and with unburied human remains. It fell somewhere around 1180. Whether that destruction was the historical kernel of the Trojan War, or simply one more town going down in a decade when a great many towns went down, cannot be established and probably never will be. What is established and what is genuinely startling is that the Hittite archives talk about the place. Among the tablets from Hattusa are letters and treaties concerning a kingdom the Hittites called Wilusa in the right region, which most linguists accept corresponds to the Greek name Ilios, which is the other name for Troy, and the one that gives the Iliad its title. One treaty with a king of Wilusa survives, and the king's name is Alexandru, which is very close to Alexandros, which is the alternative name Homer gives to the Trojan prince Paris. The same archives repeatedly mention a foreign power called Ahiawa across the sea to the west, which the Hittites treated at times as a rival and at times as an equal great king, and which is almost certainly the Mycenaean Greek world, a name that sits very near Homer's word for the Greeks, the Achaeans. The letters describe Ahiawan interference on the Anatolian coast, disputed towns, a renegade operating in the region, and at one point, a Hittite king writing to complain about it. There is no letter describing a 10-year siege, and no mention of a wooden horse. What there is documentary evidence that Greeks and Hittites were in contact and in friction over precisely the stretch of coast where the poems say a war was fought, in precisely the right centuries. It does not prove the Trojan War happened. It proves something more useful, which is that the world Homer describes was not invented. There really was a wealthy fortified city at that spot, ruled by kings with names of the right shape, quarreled over by Greeks and by an Anatolian empire, and it really did burn at the end of the Bronze Age, along with everything else. The Levant was different, and it is the most interesting case because the collapse there did not empty the land, it rearranged it. Along the southern coast of Canaan, 5 cities emerged in the aftermath with a material culture that is unmistakably part Aegean. The pottery is made locally, but in Mycenaean shapes with Mycenaean decoration. The architecture uses hearths of a kind that had not been built there before. The people ate pork, which their neighbors in the hill country conspicuously did not. Loom weights change shape. These are the Philistines, the Peliset of the Egyptian inscriptions, and what the archaeology shows is not a conquering horde, but a population arriving, settling, building towns, and then over the following centuries, gradually blending, until within a few hundred years, they were worshiping local gods with local names and writing in a local script. Inland in the hills, small unwalled villages appear in the same period in numbers that had not been there before. Farming terraces cut into slopes, and the people in them appear over time as Israel and Moab and Ammon and Edom. Further north, the Aramean kingdoms formed, and along the coast, the old Canaanite ports of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, which had been comparatively minor next to Ugarit, survived the collapse largely intact and inherited the entire maritime trade of the Mediterranean by the simple expedient of still being there. This is worth holding on to because it is the part the word collapse obscures. The great palaces failed. The peoples did not. What replaced the empires was smaller, poorer, and far more numerous, and out of it came most of the nations and languages and religions that the following 1,000 years would be made of. Mesopotamia is the other survivor, and it is worth a moment because it was damaged but not erased. Assyria and Babylonia sat inland, far from the coasts where the migrations came ashore, on rivers rather than on rainfall, which meant that a century of poor rain hurt them without starving them outright. Both contracted. Assyria lost territory it had held in the west and spent something like 2 centuries in a reduced and defensive condition, harassed by Aramean groups moving in from the steppe. Babylon was sacked by the Elamites, lost its great statue of Marduk to the enemy, and went through a long unsettled period of short reigns and disputed successions. But cuneiform never stopped being written in Mesopotamia. The scribal schools kept going. The astronomical records kept accumulating. The temples kept their archives, and the literature was copied and recopied, which is the whole reason the Epic of Gilgamesh was still being read in a library at Nineveh 500 years after the Bronze Age ended. Whatever went wrong across the eastern Mediterranean, it did not sever the thread in the river valleys, and that continuity is the single largest reason we can read anything about this period at all. And in time, Assyria came back. The state that had spent the collapse holding on to its core emerged from it, slowly and then rapidly. And by the 8th century, it had built the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, with a professional standing army, and a policy of mass deportation, and a reputation for terror that has never quite left it. The Bronze Age system produced the letters between brothers. What came out the other side of the collapse was something considerably harder. And yet, out of that silence came two things that mattered more than what was lost. The first is iron. Iron ore, unlike tin, is common almost everywhere. The technology for working it existed before the collapse, but was marginal, because bronze was better and the supply of bronze was reliable. When the supply stopped being reliable, iron stopped being marginal. It required different, hotter techniques, and early iron was not necessarily superior to good bronze, but it had one overwhelming advantage, which was that a smith could obtain the raw material locally without depending on a ship from another continent. Over the following centuries, iron replaced bronze across the region, and the Iron Age is named for a metal that won largely because the alternative had become impossible to get. The second is the alphabet. The great scripts of the Bronze Age, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Linear B, all required years of training and a class of professional scribes attached to an institution. The alphabet, developed and refined along the Levantine coast and carried outward by Phoenician traders in the centuries after the collapse, needed a few dozen signs. It could be learned by a merchant in a few weeks. It could be used to write any language. When writing returned to Greece, around the 8th century, it returned in this form, borrowed from the Phoenicians with the addition of vowels, and it was not in the hands of palace accountants. It was in the hands of anybody who wanted it, and the first substantial things written in it were not inventories of sheep. They were poems about a war fought by kings who lived in citadels with enormous walls, long ago, before everything went wrong. This is the strangest part of the whole story. The Greeks of the classical age had no idea that Linear B had existed. They did not know their ancestors had kept accounts. What they had was Homer and a body of legend about the age of heroes, and archaeologists spent a long time assuming it was pure invention. Then Mycenae was excavated, and the walls were there. The palaces were there, and when Linear B was read, some of the place names in the tablets matched the catalog of ships in the Iliad, and some of the personal names matched names in the poems, and some of the gods matched, and the boar's tusk helmet described in the Iliad, which no classical Greek had ever seen, and which scholars had assumed was fantasy, turned out to be a real Mycenaean object that has been dug up. The poems are not history. They were composed centuries after the events, orally transmitted, full of anachronism, describing a society that mixes the Bronze Age with the poet's own time. But something got through. A memory of a lost world of great walls and rich kings crossed 4 centuries of illiteracy, carried entirely in the mouths of people reciting, and arrived at the other end distorted but not empty. That may be the truest thing this whole period has to say. The palaces went, and the archives went, and the trade routes went, and the kings who called each other brother went, and the letters stopped. What survived was not the paperwork of the civilization, but its stories, held by people who had no idea they were the last ones holding them. The tablets, of course, survived too, in their fashion, waiting. Amarna was found by a woman digging for fertilizer. Ugarit was found by a plow. Hattusa was found on a ridge in Anatolia by travelers who did not know what they were looking at. The Uluburan ship was found by a sponge diver who mentioned it in passing. Nearly everything we know about the most connected age of the ancient world was recovered by accident, from things that were never meant to last, preserved by the fires that destroyed the places holding them. And the letters themselves are still readable. A king of Cyprus apologizing for a late shipment because his coppersmiths have died. A king of Mitanni, 3,500 years ago, complaining that the statues he was promised turned out to be wood underneath. A king of Ugarit, writing that his ships are elsewhere, and his soldiers are elsewhere, and the country is left to itself, and asking if anyone else has heard anything. Nobody wrote back. But the letter is still here, and we are still reading it. That is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, from a world of brothers and gift exchange to a hungry coastline and 400 years of silence, and the two small inventions that came out of the dark on the other side. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting on the screen whenever you feel ready. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments. But there is no rush now. Set everything aside, let your shoulders drop, and let the day go. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.